About a month ago, I played a game called Felvidek. And if I wanted to describe Felvidek to someone who had never seen it before, I'd probably say it's a medieval comedy turn-based Japanese role-playing game set in an alternative reality Slovakia with a retro analog horror aesthetic. Which, let's be real here, is kinda just word soup. It's a bunch of common game description buzzwords unceremoniously slammed together to create something semi-coherent. But I really do think this is the best way to describe Felvidek. And the reason why I haven't shown you what the game actually looks like yet is because I want you to come up with your own mental image of what it could be based on the description: a medieval, comedy, turn-based Japanese role-playing game set in an alternative reality Slovakia with a retro analog horror aesthetic. You got it? Okay. Here's Felvidek. Now, I can't possibly know what image came to your head when you heard this explanation and how close it wound up being to what the game actually is. Maybe you nailed it, maybe you got sent into a totally different direction. But now that you've seen what the game actually looks like and have a super basic grasp of its weird blend of humor, acidic visuals, and classic JRPG combat, the last thing I need you to know about Felvidek is that it's incredibly simple. It's got some secrets and a few small side objectives, but really it's a small-scale title with a relatively straightforward narrative, no dialogue choices, no leveling system, and combat that's stripped down to the absolute bare essentials. You don't even have buffs or weaknesses here. If you carved out the time, you could probably beat this game in a single afternoon, and you should, because it's a pretty fun game, but its simplicity as an experience is kind of in stark contrast to its lack of explainability as a product. Genuinely, the hardest thing about Felvidek is explaining Felvidek. In fact, even the definition I gave it is incredibly flawed, because despite even the official Steam page of the game designating it as a JRPG, it is both not Japanese and also not really a role-playing game, missing major staples of that genre and sort of wearing its essence as a mask instead. Also, this explanation makes it seem like kind of a strange, enigmatic, deeply weird, and subversive game, but when you actually get your hands on it, it kind of feels normal and accessible, even when it delves into some psychedelic stuff. It doesn't quite fit into that box I gave it, but it also can't be properly explained if I eliminate elements of that explanation, which makes it, in my opinion at least, genreless. If there's one thing about the modern games landscape that excites me the most, it's how many of its long-standing barriers are starting to break down. Whether it's the barrier for entry for players, the barrier for entry for devs, or the barrier between different styles and genres. And in a lot of ways, Felvidek is kind of a poster child for all this. It's a game that can run on basically anything, like even the most low-end, rinky-dink piece of garbage. You can play it on the go, it was made using RPG Maker, which is a super accessible tool for new devs, and it dips its toes into all these different ideas and aesthetics without becoming incoherent. It's a game that I truly believe couldn't have really existed before now, at least not in this way. But even outside of this example, I don't think we're giving enough credit to how much genre mashing is going on a consistent basis. At a point where basically every single genre that's ever going to exist has already been around for decades, modern innovation is coming not in the creation of new genres, but in the transcendence of them. And this is happening at every stage of development, even at the largest scale. So in this video, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this idea. Not all of the games I'm going to be talking about are new, but I want to analyze them through this very specific lens and take a look at what works, what doesn't, and how it fits into the broader ecosystem of games. So let's talk about some games with no genres. But before we talk about that, I need you to hear something real quick. That's the sound that I hear every single time I sit down to start editing, and also during editing, and every single time I turn half a centimeter in this chair that's become the bane of my existence. And it's a sound that I can finally stop hearing thanks to the sponsor of this video, FlexiSpot. This is the C7 Max chair, a chair that's quickly moved into my top
one slot of most comfortable things I've ever sat on. Not just because it has the nicest seat cushioning that I've ever seen, which it does, and not just because it has a great supportive headrest and optional footrest for you to just lay back and relax on, but also because it's incredibly customizable, so you can turn it into the perfect chair for you. You can adjust the armrests, move them in and out, spin them around. You can use them like this, like this, like this, even like this. I don't judge, whatever works for you. You can also adjust the headrest height and rotation to suit you perfectly, and you can even adjust the backrest to get you perfect lumbar support. You ever seen anything like that? That's crazy. It makes this chair look like a piece of garbage. But I also spend enough time at my desk that getting up and stretching is really important, which is where this bad boy comes in, the E7 Pro standing desk. I really like standing desks because they're so much healthier for you than just sitting around all day, but also I didn't use my last one in its standing form very often because it sort of sounded like an old man getting off the couch every time I moved it up and down. But the E7 Pro has just been way sturdier, smoother, and a lot more reliable. My old desk always seemed like it was about a half a second away from crumbling right before my eyes, but with this one, I can use my desk as my chair and my chair as my desk and not have to worry about anything falling apart. I don't know why I would do that, but I can. They both come with decade-plus warranties and 30 days risk-free returns. There's also a ton more options to choose from on their site, including other home and office furniture. And best of all, if you use the link in my description and use the code C750, you can get a whole $50 off of your C7 Max. That's code C750 for $50 off. Thank you FlexiSpot for sponsoring this video and also helping me upgrade my home office during my move. I have a horrible confession to make. Until a few weeks ago, I had never beat Shadow of the Colossus. I did own the HD remaster of the original on PS3 and played a few hours of it back in the day, and I also have the PS4 remake and thought I had finished it already, but when I started working on this video and looked at my save slot, it turns out I only got halfway through this thing. I genuinely could have sworn I beat this game. I guess I already knew how it ended beforehand, so maybe that's why it got all tangled up. But even though I was surprised at first to learn that I dropped it midway, when I thought about it a little bit more, I started remembering why I put it down all those years ago. I really respected what it was and what it meant to the industry, but I also felt like time hadn't done it a ton of favors, even with the facelift Blueprint gave it. I remember complaining to my brother about the clunky movement, the unwieldy camera, and the long, dry stretches of land you traversed as the game sent you back to the center of the landscape after defeating each Colossus. It felt antiquated to control, but more importantly, it felt a little bit empty. And even though I knew that was kind of the point, I'll admit that playing it 6 years ago, it didn't do for me what it had done for so many other people. But playing it today was a whole different story. The music, the designs, all the distinct locations in this barren land that constantly surprised me with their diversity, it felt like I was playing a totally different game. I almost didn't recognize it. Controlling Wander still kind of feels like somebody slammed a screwdriver into your controller, and the camera does have a mind of its own, so it was impossible to get any of the nice panning shots I wanted to for this video, but those complaints were completely drowned out by the sheer beauty of the experience. Trotting through this dead world in search of foes that have done you no harm, sizing yourself up against each imposing figure, hearing the mournful braying of the colossi as you topple them, it all felt so direct and cutting and like a genuine breath of fresh air. I think when I first played this game, I was still in a place where I wanted more straightforward action and storytelling from my games, and I felt like all of this empty space was just sort of lying there unused. But playing it today felt like sitting in the eye of the storm. In the midst of all of these maximalist worlds that always look to drive gameplay moments, here was something that was confident in its emptiness. When I searched up which games people thought were most like Shadow of the Colossus, one of the most common answers was Breath of the Wild, with its sort of lax open world and focus on action puzzle elements. But even that world is massive and gamified and has all these different side activities and enemy encounters. This, in contrast, is so cut and dry, and it's that absence of normal game conventions that makes it stand out as much as it does. In fact, controls aside, I'd say that Shadow of the Colossus becomes more impressive and more impactful with every year that passes, because after being out for decades and making an undeniable and emphatic stamp on the history of games, it's still
peerless. There's really nothing else like it. Games like Journey and even Eco itself share its cinematic 3D foundation and light puzzle elements, but they don't share the same creature climbing and boss rush structure that define the majority of the gameplay. A game like Solar Ash, on the other hand, does share those more specific elements, but loses the fundamentals, being much more of a speed-based 3D platformer. You can sort of orbit around what Shadow of the Colossus is, but you can't be truly like Shadow of the Colossus without just being a copy of Shadow of the Colossus. Case in point, Pray for the Gods, probably the closest thing out there to Team Eco's classic, kinda just comes off as Shadow of the Colossus again, but with some light survival elements. It's not even a bad game or anything, it's just very openly derivative. The original game is just too exact to create a new subgenre, but you also can't really capture it with the terminology we have in place. I'd say it's probably closest to a 3D puzzle platformer, but it also doesn't present itself like any other puzzle game. It's just this weird enigma in the history of games that's nestled itself into a spot that can only really be defined as Shadow of the Colossus. And I think it's easier to appreciate its uniqueness once you start to truly understand how far it is from anything familiar, which is probably why I enjoyed it so much more after playing so many more games. Once I stopped comparing it to other things and instead viewed it as almost a respite from everything else I've tried, it really coalesced into just a perfect experience. Well, actually, okay, hold on. Can I go into spoilers real quick? That's fine, right? The game's been out 20 years. I think I'm the last person in history to play it. I just gotta say, the 11th Colossus can gobble my novel. Honestly, the quality of the Colossi can vary quite a bit. There are definitely some that lend themselves to a lot of awkward repetition, but the 11th Colossus especially sucks major donkey butt. He was my least favorite by far. He isn't even colossal. What the hell's up with that? But at least, the one thing with this game is that every single Colossus is unique, so you only have to fight each one. Also, like I said, the camera's a little bit strange, and also Wander doesn't really control super well. Also, I thought some of the environment design choices could have been tightened up. Also, I didn't like how quickly and often that disembodied voice gave you hints on how to defeat the Colossi. Also, you're telling me this horse comes back totally fine after this fall? That is the stupidest thing I've ever... Okay, so the game's not perfect. At all. But that's also kind of the price you have to pay for a game like this. Anything unfamiliar is gonna feel uncomfortable at first. If it's not, then it's probably not as unique as you think it is. It kind of reminds me of that old Alien Resurrection review where the guy said that the most terrifying part of the whole thing was the controller setup, and then went on to describe what is now the industry standard for joystick movement. Even stuff that becomes normal later feels a little bit awkward the first time it's introduced, and in the case of Shadow of the Colossus, it never really became normal, so it's always gonna feel a little bit awkward, but succeeds nonetheless. No roads really lead in or out of this game, which I think is a pretty incredible feat, but I also don't think it has to be the case for every genre-less game. In fact, I actually think one of the best ways to get into a new genre is by playing something that takes that genre and then breaks all of the rules and then slams it against a bunch of other stuff until it's basically unrecognizable. It sort of Trojan horses you into liking something that you wouldn't have otherwise, which is actually exactly what happened to me when I played Inscryption. Inscryption is a game where everything is just a little bit off. I wouldn't really call it a horror game, but it's definitely drenched in these horror aesthetics, and it uses that atmosphere to give everything in its world weight. From exploring this strange, uninviting cabin filled with odd puzzles as you learn more about where you are and who your opponent is, only for each answer to raise more questions, to actually playing the card game at the center of its loop and quickly understanding that something very real and alive is underpinning all of it, to even just the impact of each move as defeated cards disintegrate and successful attacks cause bones to slowly weigh the odds in your favor. Horror is a huge part of why everything feels important and gripping in Inscryption, and it's a huge part of why I even decided to give the game a shot in the first place. Even though I wouldn't really consider myself much of a horror guy, I do like things that are considered horror adjacent, things that are drenched in misery and dread, but don't have that sole intention of making the player feel scared. I mean, Bloodborne is my favorite FromSoft game, even though I'd probably consider it the most flawed game they've made since Dark Souls 2, and a huge reason why why I love it so much is how it weaves in these Lovecraftian elements into its lore and visual design. Alan Wake 2 has a strong case for being my favorite game of the 2020s because of all of its weird, freaky Twin Peaks bullshit. And in Inscryption's case, this grainy, claustrophobic, umbral presentation not only made me fall in love with this game, but kinda got me over my long-standing beef with card games in general. For a really long time, I avoided card games like the plague. There was just something cheap and toy-like about them, and I didn't really understand the appeal. Don't get me wrong, I'm fine with playful, glitzy-looking games. There are some games that I love that literally look like you are playing with toys, but I could just never take card games seriously. I think it's because they're essentially turn-based combat, which I've never been the biggest fan of, in a package that reminds me of my old Pokemon card collection, which is something that I never really understood how to play. I just saw them as fun little collectibles, so any card game I came across just looked a little silly to me by default. Even Slay the Spire, which does have elements that speak to me a lot more than something like, say, Hearthstone, still leaned a little bit too hard into elements that I wasn't the fondest of to really capture my attention. But even though at its heart, Inscryption is very much a card game, its ability to dress up that genre in a way that I've never seen before made me reevaluate my entire opinion on these games. I like puzzle elements in games, I like a nice underlying mystery, I like a game with twists and turns so wild that you can't really show them in a video essay because you want people to experience it themselves. I like roguelikes, I like games with good meta progression, and I like games that are horror adjacent. I liked so much about Inscryption that I felt like I had to try it even though I didn't like its most prominent feature. And by the end of it, I walked away feeling successfully Trojan horsed. All of its weird, complicated ideas distracting me from the boring card stuff long enough for me to realize that the boring card stuff was actually super fun. And I think ultimately, Inscryption is the reason why I gave Balatro a try, even though the reasons why I like that game are so different. It's also the reason why I tried Neon White, although in fairness that's really stretching the definition of a card game, and it's why I'm now so much more open to playing a game like Slay the Spire or another unconventional experience in Card Shark, which is more like a narrative experience a la Pentiment that expresses itself through cards. And knowing what Inscryption did for me a few years back is actually the exact reason why I decided to try Felvidek. Like I said earlier, I haven't historically been a fan of turn-based RPGs, so I needed something to ease me into it, and honestly the best option for me was the game that didn't really operate like a typical JRPG. But maybe the most interesting thing about Inscryption, at least for this video, is that the game that I find most similar to it is actually not a card game at all. Benny Bash is a new indie game that released on Steam a few months ago, and it has a very similar layout to Inscryption, with all the horror escape room stuff centered around an off-brand Mario game that's hiding something sinister under the surface. It's basically, to my knowledge at least, the first real Inscryption-like, and I think it says a lot that the core gameplay has nothing to do with Inscryption's core gameplay. As great as Inscryption's card loop is, the game's defined more by its format and packaging than anything, which is really interesting to me. You may have noticed though that the way that Inscryption is genreless is a little bit different to how Shadow of the Colossus is genreless. I describe the latter as being sort of on its own island, its own idea, but in contrast, Inscryption, and also Felvidek for that matter, just take so many different ideas and weld them together until they hit a point where they become too hyper-specific to explain without writing a dissertation. You could say maybe this is more genre avoidant, while this is more of a hyper-genre. But in all cases, they definitely don't fit into any convenient definitions, which is great for players who want unique experiences, but I assume an absolute nightmare to pitch to a bunch of stakeholders, which is probably why these games are so rare outside of small studios, Inscryption and Felvidek both being indie titles, and Shadow of the Colossus coming from one of the biggest dev team anomalies in Team Eco. An extremely small studio that's been around for nearly 30 years is an internal Sony studio and has made a whopping 3 games up until this point. They're the exception to every rule. But there are a few games in AAA that do try to blur the lines a little bit more on who they're for and what they're trying to accomplish, and as a result, they tend to be met with very interesting receptions. Deathloop feels like this sprawling, gorgeous, 10,000-piece puzzle that just lightly nudges you in the right direction by playing loud sirens and blowing an air horn in your ear anytime you put something in the wrong place. In concept, this game is such a wonderful blend of interesting ideas. It's a time loop game, but not a roguelike, more like a non-linear mystery-solving experience with stealth action elements. It plays around with some 3D Metroidvania concepts, combines them with a much more action-focused strain of the Dishonored game loop, and then wraps it up in this wonderful 1960s sci-fi aesthetic with the promise of being able to tackle it in 1,000 different ways. It should have come out as this glorious, spindly, rough new shape of a game, but it feels like somebody saw that and thought, well, that's too confusing, and just sanded it down into a shockingly generic final form. There aren't a million paths to take, instead you're spoon-fed directions as things conveniently fall into place. You quickly realize that a tactical approach to anything is pointless because the game has some of the stupidest enemy AI of all time, and the highly marketed infused multiplayer element is so half-baked that I don't even remember how it works, and the game's not even that old. I don't know if the game was neutered during playtesting, or if it was because of publisher pressure, or the team just wanted to broaden its appeal, but you can sense that there's something brilliant under the surface. It's just been horrifically flattened. And I think that's why it was received so strangely. All these different outlets were giving it 10 out of 10s and calling it a generational masterpiece, while some players found it genuinely insulting to their intelligence. And now, it's just disappeared from the zeitgeist. No one brings it up, ever. This game is newer than Doom Eternal. It comes from the same publisher, and it has the same critic score on Metacritic, but you could probably watch 100 video essays right after this one, and they wouldn't even use it as B-roll. And I feel like it's the perfect example of why AAA games struggle to match even a fraction of the ingenuity and strangeness of smaller titles. You can almost see the creative and commercial elements of this game duking it out and eventually neutralizing each other. Looking at Deathloop, it feels like maybe a truly strange, genre-defying AAA game either can't exist or requires a perfect storm to come together. Something insanely specific, like, I don't know, the biggest rock star in the entire industry goes through a massive public breakup with the company he'd been working with for decades, and then leaving to make his own company, and then receiving a massive blank check from the biggest publisher in the entire industry to say, hey, here, you have full creative control, make your weird, freaky heartbreak album. And then he goes into his little gamer cave and comes out 3 years later and says, I figured it out. Game where you take packages, don't drop packages, save America, game. For a really long time, I avoided playing Death Stranding. I remember its release in 2019 having a bit of a deflating energy, as people grappled with how different this game was to what they were expecting, and how clunky and weird it felt to play. It didn't really review poorly necessarily, but opinions were definitely extremely split at launch, some finding the beauty in its oddities, while others thought that Kojima was a little bit high on his own supply. His claim that the game was the first Strand-type game particularly got a lot of heat. It seemed like an attempt to make the game seem more impressive and groundbreaking than it actually was. In fact, the term Strand-type became a meme, as people criticized Kojima's bold assertion that Death Stranding was a totally new type of game, a new genre entirely, when in reality, a lot of people just called it a glorified walking simulator. But even outside of all that noise, the game loop of Death Stranding never really looked all that appealing to me personally, so its kind of split reception was enough for me to write it off as something that I'd never personally get around to. And honestly, I wasn't that hung up about it. I had a whole heap of stuff to get to anyways. I didn't need another 50-hour game in my backlog. But over the years, it seems like people have been coming around a lot more on Death Stranding, and a lot of people were telling me I might enjoy it in the comments of my KCD2 video, and with Death Stranding 2 having released to incredible reviews, and a few of my friends having hopped into the first game as a result, I thought, you know what? I'll give it a shot. Worst case scenario, I'll play it for a few hours, realize it's not for me, and move on. Well, I'm currently 30 hours into the first Death Stranding. I still kind of don't know exactly where I land on it. There are a lot of things that I definitely don't love, but I'll say two things that I think are really important. One, I think I'm gonna finish it, and maybe even play Death Stranding 2 at some point. And two, I think Kojima was right about this being the first Strand-type game. See, Death Stranding to me is kind of like the Krusty Krab Pizza episode of SpongeBob. There's so many deviations from the standard episode formula, it's got this goofy setup that forces characters to trek through endless, perilous terrain to deliver pizza, which is something you can actually do in Death Stranding.
Krusty Krab Pizza, it's the pizza for you and me.
This is exactly how it feels to drive any of the vehicles in this game, and behind the episode being, like any episode of SpongeBob, completely absurd, it does kind of reach into some darker emotions of being trapped and lost and tired, but still driven by the idea of making somebody on the other end of this journey smile. And all of that is just the entire essence of Death Stranding. I might be stretching the comparison a little bit here to make it work, but you know what I'm getting at. And if Death Stranding is the Krusty Krab Pizza episode of SpongeBob, I kinda see Kojima's comment comments on the game being the first Strand-type game to be like one of those video essays where people get way too into the SpongeBob lore and start talking about how dark and unique and mature it actually all is. And it has one of those thumbnails that looks like this, and the video is called, like, How SpongeBob Explored Capitalist Absurdism. It's like, okay, you're not wrong, I guess, and the episode is good, and your points are making some sense, but this is a little extra, right? Like, it's a little bit silly to be talking about this as if it's rigorously dense social commentary. That's the feeling I have when I think of Death Stranding being the first Strand-type game. I don't think it's that serious. I don't think a wheel has been reinvented or a path has been created to a whole new world of possibilities, but I do ultimately agree with the takeaway that there's no game like Death Stranding. What other game has such high production value, cinematic flair, and photorealistic environments ripe for you to explore while also being a quasi-horror, tangentially stealth-focused, collaborative online package delivery game where a core feature that has genuine gameplay ramifications is making Norman Reedus take a shower? Zooey mama. Yeah, the game can be reduced to just going from point A to point B delivering packages. It is kind of just a walking simulator, but there are so many wrinkles thrown into that formula that I honestly think the only game that's similar to Death Stranding is Death Stranding 2. In fact, and I might get a little bit of shit for saying this, but I think the closest relative to the Death Stranding franchise is honestly Shadow of the Colossus. Both games ebb and flow between serene and stressful. Both place strong emphasis on the path between your destinations having gone to the rapture. Both reject a lot of the classic action elements that they seem to be perfectly set up for in favor of prioritizing environmental interaction instead. Hell, both of them even control a little bit strange and revolve around simple climbing mechanics where you just have to hold the triggers and manage your stamina. And I also believe they both succeed, ultimately, by breaking the established rules of video games, even if that means that not every idea pays off perfectly. That said, I do think Death Stranding is a much more flawed game than Shadow of the Colossus is, and I think I could have taken a few more cues from it in order to avoid some of its biggest pitfalls. There's way too many systems that you're constantly being bombarded with, way too much exposition, way too many things that stop the game from getting into a real flow state, and holy hell, that UI is a nightmare. I thought Metal Gear Solid 5 was bad, but this is just insane. It sacrifices all of its readability in order to make things look all cool and tactical and like military mission logs. I hate it. And it sucks that the game gets in its own way so often, because striking off into the world and listening to the music from the game, or just stuff you put on yourself, is a really transportive experience. I loved going on a long delivery and just listening to some shoegazy stuff, or the new Quedeca album, or like Kid A. It's just such a great vibe. Also, I thought all of the collaborative elements of the game were really great. I had heard of some of this beforehand, but I didn't realize that you could finish other people's structures, or hand deliveries off to other players, or complete deliveries people had sent over, share your equipment with them. That stuff's really cool, and a really interesting spin on asynchronous multiplayer. And even though I have so many issues with this game, including the wonky terrain physics, I think that list of really interesting spins is why it's managing to keep me invested through it all. There are just so many things here that I haven't really seen done before, at least in this way. And the fact that this game even exists as like a AAA Sony exclusive with a sequel feels like a genuine glitch in the Matrix. Like, this is not supposed to be happening. If you guys are interested in hearing all of my thoughts on the game, you should definitely check out the new episode of Code Cleric. It's entirely dedicated to mine and Landon's first time playing through this game, and our very strange conditional love for it. A lot of people pine for the days when video games were more experimental and you couldn't exactly tell what was going to happen next. When you look at that old review of Alien Resurrection, it's kind of crazy to think that not even that long ago in the grand scheme of things, people were being shocked at how different games were setting up their control scheme for a 3D game. That's not even a question that pops into our mind anymore when we see a new trailer. It's become so standardized that everyone already knows what to do, everyone knows at a base level how it's going to feel to play, and in a way, that is a microcosm of the loss of innovation as time goes on. But also, that's not something we have any control over. There just hasn't been another solution to camera control that's felt as natural or intuitive. I don't know if that'll ever change, but there's a reason why everyone's gravitated towards this. this. And if we found the perfect solution to 3D camera controls in 2000, then we found the perfect solution. You can't go back and undo that. Successfully innovating on things sort of cosmically means there's a little bit less to innovate on. That's just how it works. But that innovation can also reveal new paths that you couldn't access before, ways to fly off in all these new, novel directions. And I think in this era of higher standardization, there are a lot of studios that have continued to break the mold by bridging genres in ways that we've genuinely never seen before. The games I mentioned here are kind of the extreme examples, but they're also not the only ones. Nier Automata shoves gameplay elements of like 8 different types of action games into one experience. Hazelight is managing to effectively string together a bunch of really fleshed out game jam-esque experiences under one umbrella, and games like Mario Odyssey and The Plucky Squire are merging 2D and 3D gameplay in a way that I can honestly see evolving and becoming more common in the years to come. There is always something innovative happening, even if it doesn't take the shape that it once did. The question is, are you willing to take the plunge and try something different? And I think you should, especially if you've been feeling a little bit burnt out on games recently. Some of my favorite experiences of the last 5 years have been from genres that I don't even consider myself a fan of. My favorite game of the year is a turn-based RPG. Keep putting yourself out of your comfort zone. You really won't regret it. Thanks again to FlexiSpot for sponsoring this video. You can check them out in the description and in the comments, or you can use my code to get $50 off your purchase. They have stuff of all different budget ranges. A couple of my friends actually got their stuff recently, and they've been really liking it. I highly recommend checking them out. If you want to see more of me, you can check out the Code Cleric podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Like I said, there's an episode dedicated to Death Stranding on there now. Also, feel free to check out my second channel. There's going to be a video there soon about my favorite indie games that I've been playing recently. Subscribe here as well if you're new, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.